Greetings, world history. This is Mr. Janosiak, and I am coming to you from my home. Today we're going to finish the Russian Revolution. The content is from chapter 20, page 290 to 293, if you would like to do that on your own. Just as a side note, going through this part of Russian history and the establishment of the the Soviet Union, it really is an incredibly sad story, as the Russian people had been looking for change from the oppression of the Tsar and the monarchy, and hopefully we will see how Vladimir Lenin and the communists not only continue a system of oppression, but in many ways ramp it up at the expense of innocent people. So, Civil War. The Bolsheviks moved quickly to solidify their power. They reaffirmed censorship of the press, created a new secret police force to deal with those who opposed them, and ended Russia's participation in the Great War. They also had to deal with the democratic elections the people had been promised after the February Revolution. The Bolsheviks controlled only Petrograd, Moscow, and some other industrial regions, so Lenin only reluctantly agreed to let the elections take place. Less than 25% of the delegates elected to the new National Assembly were Bolsheviks. Rather than share power with other parties, Lenin forced the assembly to disband. This plunged Russia into a complicated 3-year civil war. Right? People were mad at the Tsar for dissolving the Duma, and here you have Lenin doing essentially the same thing. The Bolsheviks formed an army called the Red Army in February 1918. In Europe, the color red historically symbolized socialist revolution. In March, they changed the name of their party to the Communist Party. The Communists, or Reds, were opposed by anti-communist forces called the Whites. The Whites included Russians who wanted to restore the monarchy, supporters of the provisional government and capitalist democracy, and some Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries. Peasant forces, called the Greens, fought to keep their land free of both red and white control. So just one comment about the Whites. It's not so much that they had an idea they were fighting for, but they altogether were resisting the Reds. This lack of an ideological conformity will hurt the Whites in the Russian Civil War. The Whites were aided by the Allies, mainly the United States, Britain, and France, who provided troops and supplies. The Allies did this in part because they did not want Russia to pull out of World War I, but they also did this because they feared that the communists would spread their revolution if they were not defeated. Indeed, Lenin formed an organization called the Comintern in 1919 to organize and aid communist parties in other nations. However, the white armies were hopelessly divided by both geography and the causes for which they were fighting. These factors weakened the whites and helped lead to their defeat. The Red Army also had to deal with nationalist movements in non-Russian parts of the former empire. Rather than granting these regions complete independence, the communists established 6 self-governing Soviet republics. By 1922, they had defeated the Whites and the Greens and joined these republics with Russia to form the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, also known as the Soviet Union and USSR. So remember, right, under the monarchy, Russia had its own empire, as we have been covering through the age of imperialism. When Russia becomes communist, instead of granting these places independence, they become separate kind of governmental structures called Soviets, along with the Russian Soviet, to form the Communist Soviet Union. Faced with unrest as well as civil war, the communists used extreme measures to stay in power. They called these measures the Red Terror. Lenin ordered the secret police to arrest any person suspected of being an enemy of the revolution. Potential enemies included nobles, religious leaders, merchants, former government officials, non-communist revolutionaries, and other members of the educated middle class. Striking workers and peasants who resisted war communism also faced harsh punishments. Okay, we were trying to leave the despotism of the Tsar, And look what we have traded it for, Russia. The police were permitted to execute anyone they arrested. It is estimated that as many as 300,000 persons met this fate. They included the Tsar and his entire family, whom Lenin ordered to be killed in July 1918. Yes, Lenin has Tsar Nicholas, his wife, and their many children brutally murdered after overthrowing the monarchy and holding them in prison. Thousands of other, quote, enemies were held in prisons or under harsh conditions in prison camps, where many more died. Lenin was motivated by his firm belief that the only way the revolution would survive was if the Bolsheviks retained control. Remember, the Bolshevik vision of establishing communism is not the natural growth of communism by the working class, but rather the control of an educated political class, like Lenin himself, who would retain the people's conformity to communism. So you have a lot of resistance to communism here in the early 1900s. But Lenin and the Bolsheviks, because of their belief in that small group who would lead them to communism, retain power by any means necessary. Notice, of course, the tremendous crackdown, violence, and brutality that the Bolsheviks have used to get the people to be, well, let's say, consumed or conquered by communism. Oops, I already read this. I apologize. I will pause here for a second for the notes. I went over this. And in 1921, Lenin replaced war communism with a new economic policy, or NEP. The Civil War had ended in victory for the Reds, but the peasant revolts continued. Lenin realized that the Bolshevik Revolution could not survive if the countryside opposed it. The NEP relaxed the extreme policies of war communism. Taxes replaced the requirement that peasants provide the government with food. Farm products could now be freely bought, sold, and traded. Communications, transportation, and major industries such as mining, oil, and steel remained under government control. However, other businesses could be privately owned and operated for profit. As Lenin was reshaping Soviet communism, his health was beginning to fail. His death in 1924 set off a power struggle in the Communist Party. Over the next 4 years, Party Secretary Joseph Stalin outmaneuvered and eventually ousted his rivals. By 1928, he was securely in power. So, to summarize very quickly, the political systems. The conditions that led to the Russian Revolution arose in the mid and late 1800s. Russia's czars resisted giving up power in the face of growing discontent. The reforms they did make increased Russia's desire for greater change. The revolution that eventually resulted had two phases. The first ended the monarchy and replaced it with a government that represented the upper and middle classes. The second phase, which brought more radical reformers to power, drew its support from the working class. Economic systems. Russian industry was growing rapidly by the early 1900s, but most Russians remained involved in agriculture. Wealth was unevenly divided. The few nobles and other Russians who owned large estates and businesses were well off, while the rural peasant masses and urban industrial workers lived in great poverty. The Bolshevik Revolution established a system in which the government controlled production in the hope of redistributing the wealth and bettering workers' lives. Social structures. Russian society historically consisted of a small class of nobles and a huge peasant class. Industrialization in the late 1800s helped to create an educated middle class as well as an industrial working class that was closely linked to the rural peasantry. The Bolshevik Revolution made society more level by elevating the status and power of the working class while destroying Russia's upper and middle classes.